Welcome back. I need to warn you about something before we start today. Not in the way that YouTube channels warn you about things to keep your attention. I mean a genuine warning. What you are about to hear is one of the most disturbing true stories I have ever researched. It is not disturbing in the way that war stories are disturbing. The scale, the numbers, the abstract horror of millions. It is disturbing in the specific, intimate, human way that only certain stories are. The kind that gets into you and stays there. The kind that you think about at 3 a.m, weeks after you heard it. If you are sensitive to descriptions of extreme human suffering, and I mean extreme, this is your moment to decide whether you want to continue. I am going to tell this story completely and honestly because it deserves to be told that way. Because the people it happened to deserve a witness. Because what was done to them was so deliberately hidden for so long that the least we can do now is look at it directly. Still here? Okay, let's talk about Nazino Island. In the spring of 1933, Joseph Stalin's government had a problem. Actually, it had many problems. The famine, the collectivization disaster, the ongoing chaos of forced industrialization. But this particular problem was a specific one, and it had a specific name. The Soviet cities were full of people who did not belong there. People without the internal passports that the new system required. People who had fled the countryside to escape the famine, who had come to the cities looking for food and work and survival. People who were, in the language of the Soviet bureaucratic system, declassified элементы, declassified elements. People without a category, people who did not fit. The solution that was proposed and approved was elegant in the particular way that Soviet bureaucratic solutions were elegant. It was simple, it was cheap, and it moved the problem somewhere that the people making the decision would never have to see it. Round them up, put them on trains, send them west Siberia, settle them in the wilderness. They will build new communities. They will become productive Soviet citizens, contributing to the development of the Eastern territories. The problem will be solved. That was the plan. What actually happened is the subject of today's video. Let's go. To understand Nazino, you need to understand the broader context of what was happening in the Soviet Union in 1933. Because 1933 was not a normal year, even by the standards of a period that had no normal years. The collectivization of Soviet agriculture, the forced reorganization of individual peasant farms into collective farms controlled by the state, had been implemented with a brutality and a speed that had destroyed the agricultural system it was supposed to improve. Grain was being seized from the countryside to feed the cities and to export abroad to pay for the industrialization that Stalin had made the central project of the Soviet state. And the countryside was starving. The famine of 1932 and 1933, known in Ukraine as the Holodomor, the death by hunger, killed millions. The exact number is still debated, but the range that historians work with is somewhere between 5 and 8 million people dead from starvation in the Soviet Union in those 2 years. 5 to 8 million people. Dying of hunger while grain was being loaded onto ships in Soviet ports and sold to foreign buyers. People fled the countryside. Of course they did. Humans flee famine. It is the oldest human response to starvation. Move, find food somewhere else, survive by moving. They came to the cities. They came to Moscow, to Leningrad, to the industrial centers of Ukraine and the Urals. They came in enormous numbers, hundreds of thousands of people flooding into urban areas that had neither the infrastructure nor the political will to absorb them. And in December 1932, the Soviet government introduced the internal passport system. Every Soviet citizen now needed an internal passport to live legally in a city. The people who had fled the countryside did not have passports. They had nothing. They were, in the system's terminology, without documents, without category, without a place. They were rounded up in Moscow, in Leningrad, in cities across the Soviet Union. Police operations swept through train stations and markets, and the places where people without anywhere to go tended to gather. They were arrested, not for any specific crime, but for the administrative offense of being where they were not supposed to be, without the documents they were not supposed to be without. And they were loaded onto trains. The trains went east, to western Siberia, to the Narim region, a vast, sparsely populated area of rivers and forests and swamp, already used by the Soviet state as a place to send people it did not want. Special settlements had been established there during the dekulakization campaigns, places where dispossessed peasants had been resettled and were supposed to build new agricultural communities under NKVD supervision. The plan was to add the new arrivals to the existing special settlements, to integrate them into the system that was already running. It was not a good system. Conditions in the special settlements were brutal. Mortality was high. The supervision was inadequate and often corrupt. But it was a system. It had infrastructure, however inadequate. It had food supplies, however insufficient. The problem was the numbers. The Moscow and Leningrad police operations produced far more people than the plan had anticipated. Tens of thousands of people being loaded onto trains and sent east, arriving at receiving points in the Narim region faster than any administrative system could process them. The special settlements were already over capacity. There was nowhere to put the new arrivals. And so someone made a decision. It is not entirely clear, even now, exactly who made it, or at exactly what level it was made. The historical record shows that the decision was made at a regional level, probably by the NKVD administration of the Narim region, faced with an impossible situation and choosing the option that most immediately solved their immediate problem. They would put the new arrivals on an island, Nazino Island, a narrow strip of land in the Ob River, approximately 1.5 kilometers long and 600 meters wide. Sandy soil, some forest, no structures, no infrastructure, no food supplies, no tools, an empty island in a Siberian river. Between May 18th and May 26th, 1933, approximately 6,000 people were transported to Nazino Island and left there. 6,000 people on an empty island, with virtually no food, no shelter, no tools, and no way off. Let me be very precise about the conditions these people arrived in, because I want you to understand what was there and what was not there before anything else happened. What was there? The island, the river surrounding it, some trees, sand, mud. What was not there? Any shelter of any kind. Any food beyond a small amount of flour that was distributed once, a few handfuls per person, at the beginning. Any tools for building shelter or hunting or fishing. Any medical supplies. Any administrative personnel beyond a small number of guards whose primary function was to prevent people from leaving the island. The people themselves were in no condition for any of this. They had been on trains for days or weeks before arriving. Many were already sick, already malnourished, already weakened by whatever had brought them to the cities in the first place. They were wearing whatever they had been wearing when they were arrested, not Siberian wilderness clothing. They arrived on an island with the clothes on their backs and nothing else. The first days were cold. May in Siberia is not summer. The temperatures at night dropped below freezing. People had no shelter. They tried to build fires, but many had no way to make fire. They tried to gather whatever material the island provided, branches, bark, whatever could be found, and make some kind of cover. They had almost no food. The flour that was distributed, not enough for anyone, distributed unevenly, distributed once, was eaten immediately. Some people tried to mix it with river water and drink it. The river water made them sick. The dysentery started almost immediately. People began to die on the first day, not in ones and twos, in significant numbers, every day from the first day. Cold, starvation, dysentery, the diseases that spread through a population of thousands with no sanitation, no clean water, no medical care. The bodies began to accumulate on the island because there were not enough people with the strength to bury them, and because the ground was partly frozen. By the end of the first week, hundreds of people were dead, and then something happened that I am going to tell you plainly because it is part of the historical record and because it needs to be said clearly without the kind of indirect language that lets people avoid confronting what actually happened. People began to eat other people. Cannibalism on Nazino Island was not a rumor or an exaggeration or a later embellishment of the historical record. It is documented in eyewitness accounts, in the reports of the guards who were present, in the official Soviet investigation that was conducted afterward. It happened. People who were starving and who watched other people die turned to the bodies for food, and some people did not wait for others to die. I want to be careful here about how I describe this, not to soften it. It should not be softened, but to be accurate. The people on that island were not monsters. They were human beings in conditions of extreme starvation that most of us cannot imagine. Extreme starvation, the kind that goes on for days and weeks, does specific things to the human mind and body. It overrides the normal inhibitions. It reduces the capacity for moral reasoning, not because people are bad, but because the brain, starving, prioritizes survival above everything else. What happened on Nazino Island was not a reflection of the people who were put there. It was a reflection of what was done to them. That said, what happened was what it was. The accounts that survived describe people being killed for their flesh, describe guards participating in some of the violence, describe a social order breaking down completely within days of arrival, describe the strongest preying on the weakest in ways that the weakest had no ability to resist. One account that has been cited by historians and that appeared in a Soviet-era letter that was preserved in the archives describes a specific incident: a young woman who had been tied to a tree and mutilated by people who were eating her while she was still alive. The account is specific, and it is corroborated by multiple sources. I am telling you this not for shock value, but because I want you to understand what 6,000 people being abandoned on an empty island with no food actually looked like. Not as a statistic, as a reality. The island became known as Ostrov Smerti, Death Island. And among the survivors and the people of the region, another name, Cannibalski Ostrov, Cannibal Island. Now let me tell you what the Soviet authorities were doing while this was happening. Not nothing. That is the part of this story that is somehow as disturbing as the island itself. They were not looking away because they did not know. They knew relatively quickly. The guards on the island were filing reports. The regional NKVD was receiving information about what was happening. The situation on the island was known in its broad outlines, if not in every specific detail, within weeks of the first deportations. And the response was inadequate in ways that are almost beyond comprehension. Some additional food was eventually sent, not enough to change the situation, just enough to slightly slow the rate of dying. Some people were eventually removed from the island and sent to other settlements in the region, but slowly, too slowly, in numbers that were a fraction of what was needed. By August 1933, 3 months after the first deportations, approximately 4,000 of the 6,000 people who had been brought to the island were dead. 4,000 people in 3 months. 2/3 of everyone who arrived. The survivors, the approximately 2,000 people who lived, were eventually moved to other locations in the Narum region. Many of them died in those locations too in the subsequent months and years. The mortality rate among the special settlers of the Narum region in 1933 and 1934 was catastrophic by any measure. Now let's talk about the investigation, because there was one. And this is one of the details of the Nazino story that I find most extraordinary. In the autumn of 1933, a Communist Party official named Vasily Valichko was sent to the Narum region to investigate the situation of the special settlers. He was a genuine investigator, not someone sent to cover things up, but someone who actually looked at what had happened and wrote down what he found. His report, sent to Stalin personally in November 1933, is one of the most remarkable documents in Soviet history. Valichko described everything: the conditions of the deportation, the state of the people who were sent, the lack of food and shelter and tools, the deaths, the cannibalism. He named it directly in an official report to the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He described the complete administrative failure that had turned a brutal policy into something that went beyond brutality, into something with no adequate name. And he concluded, this is the extraordinary part, that the people responsible for the Nazino disaster should be held accountable. That the policy of mass deportation without adequate preparation was not just a practical failure, but a moral one. He said this in a report addressed to Stalin. Stalin read the report. We know he read it because his annotations are on the document. He made marks in the margins. He underlined things. And then essentially nothing happened. A few low-level NKVD officials in the Narum region were disciplined. The regional party leadership received some criticism. The policy of mass deportation continued. The special settlements continued. The conditions in those settlements continued to be lethal. The Valichko report was classified. It was put in a file marked secret, and it stayed there for decades, until the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives began to open and researchers began to find things that had been buried for 50 or 60 years. The Nazino story became public knowledge, real public knowledge, not rumor or regional memory, but documented historical fact, only in the early 1990s, 60 years after it happened. Now I want to step back from the specific events of Nazino and talk about what this story means in a broader sense. Because Nazino is not just a story about one terrible thing that happened on one island in one summer. It is a story about a system, about how a system produces Nazino. The people who were deported to Nazino were not criminals. They were not enemies of the state in any meaningful sense. They were people who had fled a famine that the state's own policies had created, and who had come to cities looking for survival, and who had been swept up in a police operation designed to clean the cities of people who did not belong there. They were the victims of one catastrophe being processed by a bureaucratic system that turned them into the victims of another. And the officials who made the decisions that produced Nazino, the regional NKVD officers who decided to put 6,000 people on an empty island, the administrators who failed to provide food or shelter or any of the things that human beings need to survive. Those officials were not sadists, most of them. They were bureaucrats. They had a problem: too many people, not enough settlement capacity. And they made a decision that solved their administrative problem without adequately considering what it would mean for the people affected. This is how systems produce atrocities, not primarily through the decisions of evil people, but through the decisions of ordinary people within systems that have removed the normal human constraints on how other people can be treated. When the people being processed are not quite real to the people processing them, when they are declassified elemente, administrative categories, numbers and reports rather than people with faces and names, then decisions get made that would be impossible if the decision maker had to look at the faces. Stalin did not go to Nazino Island. Stalin read a report. The report had numbers and categories and administrative language. The report did not have faces. Let me tell you about some of the people who survived, because the survivors are as much a part of this story as the dead. The 2,000 or so people who lived through the summer of 1933 on Nazino Island were sent to other special settlements in the Narim region. Most of them continued to live under conditions of significant hardship. The special settlements of the Narim region had mortality rates that, while not as immediately catastrophic as the island, were deeply abnormal by any standard. Some survived the special settlements too. Some eventually, years later, after Stalin's death, after the partial opening of the system that came with Khrushchev's thaw, were released. Some returned to whatever remained of their lives before. Some stayed in Siberia because there was nothing to return to. The local population of the Narim region, the indigenous Khanty people and the Russian settlers who had been there for generations, witnessed what happened on and around the island. They have their own memories of that summer, passed down through generations, of what arrived on their river and what it did to their understanding of what the Soviet state was and what it was capable of. The people of the regional town of Alexandrovskoye near the island have maintained a memory of Nazino that outlasted the Soviet suppression of the story. When the archives opened and researchers began to investigate, they found that local memory had preserved the basic shape of the truth, even across 6 decades of official silence. The local people knew. They had always known. They just could not say it. There is a memorial on Nazino Island now, a simple wooden cross erected after the Soviet Union collapsed, when it finally became possible to acknowledge what happened there. The island is not a tourist destination. It is not a well-known site. Most Russians have never heard of it. Most people in the world have never heard of it. That is one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story today. Because Nazino Island is not a footnote. It is not a minor episode in the vast sweep of Soviet history. It is a complete, contained illustration of what happens when a system decides that certain categories of people are not fully human. when the bureaucratic processing of human beings becomes so routine, so abstract, so separated from any contact with the actual humans being processed, that decisions like dropping 6,000 starving people on an empty island can be made and approved and implemented by ordinary officials doing their jobs. The famine that drove people to the cities was a policy decision. The passport system that made them criminals for being in the cities was a policy decision. The deportations were a policy decision. The decision to put them on the island was a policy decision. Each decision was made by people who were following orders or solving administrative problems or implementing the directions of the level above them. The chain of decisions is long, and it runs all the way from an empty island in the Ob River to Joseph Stalin's desk in the Kremlin. Stalin read the Valichko report. He read about the cannibalism. He read about the 4,000 dead. He made marks in the margins. And then he went on to the next document on his desk. I have been thinking about what it means to make marks in the margins of a report about 4,000 people dying on an island. What it means to read that report and then set it aside and pick up the next one. What kind of relationship with human reality, or absence of relationship with human reality, makes that possible? I do not have a clean answer. I do not think there is one, but I think the question matters. I think it matters enormously, because the system that produced Nazino did not die with the Soviet Union. The mechanisms, the bureaucratic abstraction of human beings into categories, the geographic separation of decision-makers from the consequences of their decisions, the administrative language that makes atrocity sound like logistics, those mechanisms exist in every large system, in every government, in every institution that processes human beings at scale. Nazino is an extreme case. The most extreme case requires the most extreme conditions. But the distance between Nazino and something that could happen anywhere is shorter than we would like to believe. The distance is the presence or absence of the normal human constraints: law, accountability, visibility, the ability of the people being processed to be seen as people. When those constraints are removed or weakened, the distance closes. The 6,000 people who were put on that island in May 1933 had names. They had histories. They had come from somewhere and been going somewhere, and had their lives interrupted by a famine and a police operation and a series of bureaucratic decisions that deposited them on an empty island with no food. Most of them are in the ground on that island or somewhere in the Siberian wilderness around it. Their names are mostly unknown. Their individual stories are mostly lost. What we have is the aggregate, the numbers, the reports, the accounts of witnesses, the investigation that was buried for 60 years. And the cross on the island, the simple wooden cross that says something happened here, that says people were here, that says they deserve to be remembered. They do. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. I know it was not easy. Some stories are not supposed to be easy. Some stories need to be hard, because the alternative, the easy version, the one that does not look directly at what happened, is a kind of dishonesty toward the people it happened to. If this story mattered to you, if you feel like these people deserved to have their story told, hit the like button. It helps more people find this channel and find these stories. Subscribe if you are not already here, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you had heard of Nazino before today. Tell me what this story does to your understanding of what systems are capable of. I read every comment. See you in the next one.